The USS Enterprise detected him on a Tuesday, not through sensors, not through subspace relays, not through any technology the Federation had developed in 3 centuries of space exploration. The ship's computer simply acknowledged his presence, the way you acknowledge gravity, not as data, but as fundamental truth. Captain Picard stood on the bridge, staring at readouts that made no sense. Warp signature, none. Life signs, undefined. Threat assessment, error. The computer had crashed trying to categorize what stood in the cargo bay. A human male, brown belt, jeans, no environmental suit, no explanation, just presence. Lieutenant Worf ran 17 diagnostic sweeps. Each one returned the same impossible result. The sensors weren't malfunctioning. They simply couldn't process what they were measuring. It was like asking a calculator to divide by a concept instead of a number. Data, the android with computational power exceeding most planetary networks, tilted his head in something that almost resembled confusion. His positronic brain processed 4 trillion calculations per second, yet this single organic entity created logical paradoxes in his core programming. The being registered as human, but also as something that existed outside standard biochemical classification. Schrodinger's warrior, simultaneously knowable and unknowable. The crew called him Chuck Norris because that's what the universal translator extracted from his neural patterns, but names felt inadequate. This wasn't a man who had entered their universe. This was a constant that had always been there, waiting to be discovered. Like a law of physics, no one had bothered to write down. Counselor Troji attempted an empathic reading and immediately withdrew, her face pale. She described it later as touching a neutron star with bare consciousness, infinite density, zero give, absolute certainty compressed into human form. No malice, no emotion, just inevitable outcome wearing a beard. Picard approached with diplomatic protocols rehearsed over decades. He'd negotiated with Romulans, reasoned with Q, debated with Klingon warlords. Every conflict in Federation history presumed one universal truth. Everyone wants something, and that want creates leverage. He extended his hand. Chuck Norris looked at it the way you'd look at a child offering you a crayon drawing of the sun. Not unkindly, just with the quiet awareness that the gesture existed in a different context than reality. Picard's confidence, that silver-tongued certainty that had diffused 1,000 crises, evaporated. This being didn't negotiate, because negotiation implied uncertainty about outcomes. The first 72 hours were carefully managed chaos. Starfleet Command transmitted 900 pages of first contact protocols. Xenopsychologists analyzed behavioral patterns. Tactical officers ran combat simulations that kept crashing the holodecks. Every framework, every contingency, every carefully constructed response tree assumed one thing: the entity would engage with systems of logic, emotion, or self-interest. But Chuck Norris operated on a simpler principle. Not aggression, not defense, just the fundamental understanding that when he decided something concluded, it concluded. It binary, final, absolute. The Federation had encountered gods before. This was different. Gods had wants. This had only results. Science Officer LaForge tried explaining warp physics to him, assuming ignorance. Chuck listened with the patience of a mountain listening to rain. Not because he was learning, because the explanation was happening and would eventually stop. When LaForge finished his enthusiastic breakdown of matter-antimatter reactions, Chuck nodded once. That nod didn't mean understanding. It meant acknowledgement that sounds had been made, and now the sequence was complete. Later, LaForge would tell the crew, that teaching Chuck Norris about warp drive felt like explaining addition to mathematics itself. The knowledge wasn't absent. It was just contextually irrelevant to whatever Chuck Norris actually was. The turning point came on day 4. A Romulan warbird decloaked off the port bow, weapons hot, demanding the Enterprise surrender the tactical asset they'd detected. Standard posturing, standard threat display. Picard began standard responses. Chuck Norris stood up from the chair he'd been sitting in, motionless, for 96 hours. He walked toward the view screen. Not rushed, not dramatic, just movement with destination. Worf's hand moved to his phaser. Data calculated 17 intervention scenarios. Security teams mobilized throughout the ship. Chuck Norris placed one hand against the view screen, palm flat against the image of the warbird. On the Romulan bridge, every system simultaneously failed. Not damaged, not hacked, just stopped being operational. Because continued operation had been deemed unnecessary. The Romulan commander stared at his dark console, then at Chuck Norris's image on his view screen, then at the cold realization spreading through his bridge. His crew looked to him for orders. He had none. You don't order response to inevitability. You don't strategize against conclusions. The warbird drifted, powerless, for 6 hours before auxiliary systems rebooted. When they did, the ship walked away at maximum speed without hailing, without posturing, without the theatrical honor-saving gestures Romulans typically employed. They left like prey that had accidentally wandered into a predator's den and been permitted, not defeated, permitted to flee. Picard stood in his ready room afterward, holding Earl Grey tea that had gone cold. The Federation had protocols for first contact, for warfare, for diplomacy. It had no protocol for this. Word travels fast in the Alpha Quadrant, faster than Warp 9 when it carries the scent of potential glory. 3 Klingon birds of prey intercepted the Enterprise near the neutral zone, not as enemies, but as hunters who'd caught wind of unprecedented prey. Chancellor Goron himself had transmitted the challenge, an invitation wrapped in barely concealed threat. The Klingons had heard rumors. A warrior of such prowess that Romulans fled without firing a shot. Honor demanded investigation. Pride demanded testing. Tradition demanded that such a fighter be measured against Klingon steel. Captain Martok, commanding the lead vessel, opened hailing frequencies with the ceremonial bloodlust his people had perfected over millennia. He wanted combat. He wanted story. He wanted his name in songs.
Picard tried diplomacy first, because that's what Starfleet captains do. He explained that Chuck Norris was not Federation military, not a weapon to be deployed, not a trophy to be claimed through ritual combat. His words were precise, diplomatic, layered with the cultural sensitivity that had earned him respect across dozens of species. Martok listened with the courtesy warriors extend to those they're about to ignore. When Picard finished, Martok laughed, that deep, chest-rattling Klingon laugh that sounds like controlled avalanche. He called Chuck Norris a coward, hiding behind a diplomat's skirt, called him weak, called him prey, dressed in predator's clothing. The insults were calculated, designed to provoke response. In Klingon culture, silence to such challenges meant acceptance of cowardice. Chuck Norris said nothing. The Klingons beamed aboard the Enterprise with full ceremony. 7 warriors in traditional armor, bat'leths gleaming, honor guards flanking Martok like extensions of his will. They'd done this 1,000 times. The ritualized approach, the formal declaration, the space given for opponent to arm themselves and prepare. It was theater as much as combat, a dance both sides understood. They entered the cargo bay where Chuck Norris waited, standing in the same spot he'd occupied for days. No armor, no weapon, no stance suggesting readiness. Martok's smile faltered for a microsecond. Prey that doesn't flee triggers predator confusion. But honor demanded continuation. He raised his bat'leth, recited the traditional challenge in Klingon, and charged with the speed that had earned him command. What happened next took 3 seconds. Starfleet sensors recorded it frame by frame, because human perception couldn't track the sequence. Martok's bat'leth struck toward Chuck's neck. It never arrived. Martok's forward momentum continued. His weapon didn't. Neither did his consciousness. He was simply on the deck, disarmed, breath knocked from his lungs, staring at ceiling plating while his brain caught up to his body's new position. No visible strike, no dramatic counter, just transition from vertical aggression to horizontal conclusion. The 6 honor guards reacted with trained precision, attacking in coordinated pattern that had felled everything from Jem'Hadar to Hirogen. 2 seconds later, all 6 were down, not injured, not bleeding, just comprehensively introduced to deck plating with the finality of gravity demonstrating its properties. Martok rose slowly, testing for broken bones, and finding none. His honor guard did the same, exchanging glances that communicated what their pride wouldn't let their voices admit. They'd encountered something outside their experiential framework. In Klingon culture, defeat in honorable combat brought shame only if you didn't learn from it. But this wasn't defeat. Defeat implied contest. This was the universe correcting an error in their assumptions. Martok picked up his bat'leth, looked at Chuck Norris with new eyes, and did something few Klingons ever did. He bowed, not submission, recognition, the way you'd acknowledge a supernova, not as enemy or ally, but as force that simply exists beyond politics. His voice, when he spoke, carried weight instead of bluster. He asked one question: "What are you?" Chuck Norris looked at Martok with the same expression he'd given everyone since arriving. Not hostile, not friendly, just present. He spoke for the first time since boarding the Enterprise, his voice carrying the texture of bedrock. No inflection, no emotion, just sound shaped into words. Unnecessary. One word. Martok stood there processing, warrior philosophers on his ship later debating the meaning. Unnecessary to explain. Unnecessary violence. Unnecessary question. The ambiguity wasn't mysticism, it was precision. Chuck Norris existed as outcome, not process. Questions about nature were categorically unnecessary, because nature simply is. You don't interview gravity about its intentions. You don't psychoanalyze entropy. Martok nodded once, gathered his warriors, and beamed back to his ship without the trophy he'd come seeking. The 3 birds of prey departed, but not in retreat. In recalibration, Martok transmitted a coded message to the Klingon High Council, classification level reserved for extinction-level threats and paradigm-shifting discoveries. The content was brief. The Federation possesses something that ends fights before they begin. Not technology, not tactics. Certainty. Within hours, Klingon intelligence networks activated across the quadrant, not for conquest planning, for threat assessment. The Empire had built its identity on warrior supremacy, on the belief that courage and skill could overcome any obstacle. Chuck Norris hadn't challenged that belief. He'd made it irrelevant, and irrelevance terrifies conquerors more than defeat ever could. Because defeat suggests you weren't strong enough. Irrelevance suggests strength itself was the wrong metric. On the Enterprise, Picard convened his senior staff in a conference room that suddenly felt too small. Riker sat with arms crossed, tactical mind trying to process combat that had no tactics. Worf looked simultaneously impressed and unsettled. The fight he'd witnessed violated everything Klingon culture taught about honorable combat duration. Data presented his analysis with characteristic precision. Chuck Norris had expended zero excess energy, created zero collateral damage, and achieved total incapacitation without causing injury that would require medical intervention. Efficient to the point of being unnerving. Crusher noted something else. The defeated Klingons showed no signs of trauma, physical or psychological. They'd been neutralized the way you'd pause a recording. Clinical, absolute. Reversible only because Chuck had chosen reversibility. Picard steepled his fingers, a gesture he made when philosophy collided with pragmatism. He's not hostile, he said carefully, voice carrying the weight of a man trying to convince himself. But he's not controllable, not predictable, not. He trailed off, searching for words that didn't exist in Starfleet vocabulary. Troy finished his thought. Not participant. He's audience. We're the show he's watching, and occasionally he corrects the performance. The metaphor landed heavily. Every person in that room had devoted their life to agency, to making choices that mattered, to affecting outcomes through decision and action. Chuck Norris existed in a context where those things happened around him, not to him. He was the frame the painting couldn't escape, and the Federation, built on self-determination and choice, had just learned its stage, had walls no one had noticed. Starfleet Command called an emergency session at 0300 hours Starfleet Standard Time. 16 admirals materialized via holoconference, their faces carrying the particular exhaustion that comes from being woken with problems that have no precedent. Admiral Nechayev opened the meeting with characteristic bluntness. No preamble, no protocol. Just the question everyone was thinking. What do we do with him? The silence that followed wasn't contemplation. It was the intellectual equivalent of staring into a chasm and realizing your maps didn't include chasms. Commander Shelby from Tactical suggested containment protocols. Admiral Ross from Strategic Operations pointed out you can't contain something that hasn't demonstrated confinement. Is even applicable to it. They weren't discussing a person. They were discussing a concept that happened to look like a person, and concepts don't fit in brigs. The recording of the Klingon encounter played on repeat, analysts scrubbing every frame for tactical insight. Starfleet had fought Borg cubes, species 8,472, Dominion fleets. Every threat came with patterns, weaknesses, exploitable variables. Chuck Norris presented none. Dr. Zimmerman, creator of the emergency medical hologram, suggested they were approaching this wrong, treating Chuck as entity when he might be phenomenon. We don't strategize against the speed of light, he argued. We accept it and build our physics around it. The comparison landed poorly. Speed of light doesn't walk onto your starship and make Klingon warriors question their entire cultural identity. Doesn't sit in your cargo bay radiating the calm certainty that outcomes are predetermined and struggle is just theater. You perform before accepting them. Picard watched the debate escalate from his ready room, nursing replicated coffee that tasted like compromise. He'd spent 30 years navigating impossible situations through dialogue, finding the diplomatic third option between violence and surrender. But diplomacy required mutual comprehension, required both parties to believe words could change outcomes.
Chuck Norris listened when people talked, but listening wasn't engagement. It was just waiting for sounds to stop. The captain thought about Q, that omnipotent nuisance, who tested humanity repeatedly. Q wanted things, wanted entertainment, wanted to prove points, wanted acknowledgement. That want created leverage. Chuck wanted nothing. Wanted implies lack. This being existed in a state beyond want, where outcomes simply were, and waiting for them to manifest was the only logical activity. Lieutenant Barclay, working in engineering, proposed something that made Geordie look up from his console. What if we asked him to leave? The suggestion hung in the air like a child, asking why we don't just ask the thunderstorm to move. But Geordie considered it. They'd never actually asked. They'd observed, analyzed, studied, contained all the things Starfleet did with phenomena. But Chuck Norris wasn't a spatial anomaly or a plasma storm. He was, technically, a person. Geordie brought the idea to Picard, who brought it to the admirals, who debated for 40 minutes before agreeing they had literally nothing to lose. The worst case scenario was he said no. Best case, he left. Middle case, he continued ignoring them, with the same polite disinterest he'd shown since arriving. Permission was granted to attempt communication. Picard entered the cargo bay alone, against Worf's strenuous objections. Chuck Norris sat in the same position, cross-legged on the deck, eyes open but focused on nothing external, or everything, impossible to tell. Picard had rehearsed 17 versions of this conversation, each carefully structured to appeal to different motivational frameworks. He abandoned all of them. "We don't know why you're here," he said simply. "We don't know what you want. If there's somewhere else you'd prefer to be, we'll transport you there immediately. No conditions, no expectations." Chuck looked at him with those unsettling eyes. Not hostile, not kind, just observational. "I'm where I need to be," he said. 4 words that somehow contained both answer and non-answer. Picard waited for elaboration. None came, because elaboration was unnecessary. The captain tried different angles, offered resources, offered to contact anyone Chuck might know, offered to help him return to wherever he'd come from. Each offer met with the same calm acknowledgement that the offer had been made and now existed in the past tense. Frustration crept into Picard's voice, despite his best efforts. "What do you want from us?" Chuck's expression didn't change. "Nothing." The word landed with absolute finality. "Not nothing right now, or nothing I can think of. Just nothing. Full stop. End of sentence. End of desire." Picard felt something crack in his chest. The realization that his entire career had been built on the assumption that everyone wanted something, and standing before him was proof. The assumption had exceptions. Exceptions that looked human, but operated on entirely alien axioms. Back in the conference room, Picard delivered his report to staff that looked increasingly hollow-eyed. "He's not hostile. He's not cooperative. He's not resistant. He's just present, like a boulder in a river. The river doesn't hate the boulder. The boulder doesn't obstruct the river out of malice. They're just occupying the same space, and the river has to flow around it." Riker asked the question everyone avoided. What happens if we don't want to flow around it? What if we need him gone, and he won't leave? The silence that followed was answer enough. You don't make boulders leave. You don't negotiate with gravity. You accept, adapt, or break yourself trying to resist. The Federation was built on principles that assumed agency was universal. Chuck Norris was teaching them that agency had limits they'd never imagined. Counselor Troy spoke up. her voice carrying the careful tone of someone presenting uncomfortable insight. "He's not trying to intimidate us. That's what makes this worse. Intimidation is a strategy. Strategy implies contest. He exists the way stars exist, not for us or against us, just existing, and we have to build our navigation around that fact." Data tilted his head. An apt comparison. "Counselor, stars shape the gravitational landscape of space. Chuck Norris appears to shape the causality landscape of conflict. Not through action, but through presence." Worf grumbled something in Klingon that the universal translator rendered as unacceptable. But acceptance wasn't optional. The Federation could no more vote to disapprove of Chuck Norris than they could vote to repeal thermodynamics. He was. They had to decide what that meant for everything they built. The distress call came from Colony Theta 9, a mining outpost near the Paulson Nebula. Standard evacuation alert, standard panic, standard words that Starfleet crews had learned to dread. "We are Borg. Resistance is futile." A single cube, relatively small by collective standards, but still carrying enough drones to assimilate 8,000 colonists before the Enterprise could arrive. Picard felt his chest tighten, old trauma surfacing like bones through eroded soil. He'd been Locutus once, had felt the collective's consciousness override his own, turning him into a weapon against everything he loved. The memories never fully faded. They just waited in the dark, patient as predators. He gave orders with the calm that comes from swallowing fear so completely it becomes part of your skeleton. Wake, maximum warp, battle stations, and one variable he'd never calculated before. Chuck Norris stood in the cargo bay as the red alert klaxons painted reality were it crimson. He didn't react to the sound, to the running crew members, to the ship lurching into high warp. Picard found him there, standing now instead of sitting, face carrying the same neutral expression that had become familiar and unsettling in equal measure. "We're heading into combat," Picard said, voice tight. "The Borg. I don't expect you to help, but if you have any survival instinct at all, stay here where it's..." He stopped. Safe felt like the wrong word. Safer implied degrees of danger. Chuck looked at him with something that might have been curiosity, if curiosity required muscular expression. "I'll go with you," he said. Not offered, not volunteered, just stated. Future fact. Picard wanted to argue, remembered the Klingons, remembered the Romulans, and simply nodded. The Borg cube dominated the view screen, like a malignant geometry lesson. Perfectly cubic, perfectly indifferent, perfectly inevitable. In the way only the Borg achieved inevitability, through absolute collective certainty that adaptation solved all problems. They'd assimilated thousands of species, absorbed countless technologies, turned entire civilizations into components of their machine consciousness. The Enterprise dropped from warp at maximum combat distance. Worf reported shields at full, weapons armed, tactical analysis, showing the standard impossible odds. 16,000 drones, adaptive shielding, regenerative hull. The Borg hailed with their standard greeting, that flat multi-voiced tone that stripped individuality from language itself. "We are the Borg. You will be assimilated. Resistance is futile." Picard's jaw clenched so hard his teeth ached. He'd heard those words while they stripped his humanity away piece by piece. Chuck Norris stepped onto the bridge. Crew members instinctively moved aside, creating space the way matter moves aside for black holes. He walked to the view screen, looked at the cube with the same expression he'd given everything else, calm acknowledgement of presence. Data's console began registering something unusual. The Borg cube had stopped moving. Full stop. Momentum zero. Just floating in space like someone had pressed pause on the universe's remote control. No active braking. No maneuvering thrusters. Just instant cessation of all forward motion. Picard looked at Chuck, then at the cube, then at Chuck again. "What did you do?" Chuck didn't turn from the view screen. Nothing yet. The yet hung in the air like a guillotine blade, waiting for the rope to snap. On the cube, 16,000 drones simultaneously stopped their assigned tasks. Stopped walking. Stopped assimilating. Stopped existing in coordinated purpose. The collective consciousness was experiencing something it had never encountered in 10,000 years of absorbing civilizations. Error, not malfunction, not system failure. Fundamental error at the conceptual level. It had assimilated warriors, strategists, philosophers, computers, and hive minds. Had absorbed their knowledge, their tactics, their survival mechanisms. Evolution through consumption. Adaptation through integration. But Chuck Norris presented the collective with something that couldn't be integrated, because it wasn't information. It was axiom. The Borg tried to analyze him, to categorize, to adapt. Their sensors read human biology. Their tactical subroutines calculated human threat levels. Their assimilation protocols prepared standard approaches. Every system returned the same conclusion: proceed with standard procedure. But underneath those conclusions, something deeper in the collective's mathematics was screaming. The equation didn't balance. The variables didn't align. Certainty was colliding with certainty, and only one certainty could be axiomatic. Picard watched his tactical display as Borg drones began walking into walls. Not stumbling, not malfunctioning, just walking forward until bulkheads stopped them, then continuing to walk as if the wall was the error, not their path. Some stood motionless, caught in processing loops the collective couldn't resolve. Others dismantled machinery they'd just assembled, then reassembled it, then dismantled it again, in infinite recursion. The cube's perfect geometry started developing imperfections. Panels misaligned, conduits disconnected, systems operating without purpose or coordination. Data monitored the deterioration with growing fascination, tinged with something that might have been unease in a being capable of unease. "Captain," he said carefully, the Borg appear to be experiencing cascade failure at the cognitive level. They're not damaged. They're attempting to adapt to something that makes adaptation itself a paradox. Chuck Norris tilted his head slightly, the most dramatic gesture anyone had seen him make. On the cube, systems began failing, not because they were attacked, but because the collective decided they were unnecessary. Life support in sectors holding drones, power to assimilation chambers, propulsion, weapons, defense grids. One by one, the cube's functions shut down with the finality of a mind. Deciding consciousness was too much effort. The collective was committing technological suicide, not from despair but from logical conclusion. Continuing to exist in a universe containing Chuck Norris required processing power that exceeded the collective's capacity. Adaptation required understanding the problem. The problem was that problems weren't problems when outcomes were predetermined. The Borg had spent millennia adding complexity. Chuck Norris represented simplicity. They couldn't reduce to, couldn't adapt to, couldn't survive comprehending. The cube went dark, not destroyed, not disabled, just dark. 16,000 drones standing in corridors without power, without collective consciousness, without purpose. Individual minds waking up inside bodies they no longer recognized. Memories of thousands of species flooding back without the collective structure to organize them. Picard stared at the view screen, hands gripping his chair arms until his knuckles whitened. The Borg had been his nightmare, had been everyone's nightmare. The unstoppable force that made individuality irrelevant and resistance futile. And Chuck Norris had ended them without firing the shot, without raising a hand, just by existing in proximity until the collective's logic collapsed under the weight of trying to categorize him. Crusher's medical sensors detected life signs on the cube. Confused, traumatic, but alive. They'd need rescue, therapy, years of rehabilitation. But they were individuals again, saved and shattered simultaneously. News of the Borg cube's collapse spread through subspace channels like blood through water, and the Alpha Quadrant's predators smelled it immediately. Within 48 hours, every major power had intelligence reports on their secure networks. Romulan Tal Shia, Cardassian Obsidian Order, Dominion Vorta, even the Ferengi Commerce Authority took interest, though
the concern was more economic than military. The reports varied in detail, but converged on one impossible conclusion. The Federation possessed something that could neutralize the Borg without conventional combat. Not a weapon, not a tactic, something the reports struggled to categorize using existing military terminology. Romulan analysts called it a causality disruptor. Cardassians labeled it strategic inevitability asset. The Dominion's founders simply marked it as existential variable requiring observation. Everyone agreed on one thing. The balance of power had shifted, and they didn't understand how. On QO-Nos, the Klingon homeworld, Chancellor Goran convened the High Council in emergency session. Martok stood before them, warrior scarred and unusually somber, delivering his first-hand account. He described the cargo bay, the effortless defeat, the single word, unnecessary. Other warriors might have embellished, added dramatic flourishes to make defeat more palatable. Martok spoke with the flat precision of someone reporting geological data. These weren't opinions. These were measurements of reality they'd previously miscalculated. Goran listened, his bulging eyes narrowed in thought that looked physically painful. The Empire had spent centuries building martial supremacy into their identity. Every child raised on stories of Callus, every warrior trained to believe courage and honor could overcome any obstacle. Chuck Norris wasn't an obstacle. He was the revelation that obstacles were sometimes just stories warriors told themselves. The council erupted in argument that bordered on philosophical crisis. Some demanded alliance with the Federation to secure access to this asset. Others suggested preemptive strike before the Federation learned to weaponize whatever Chuck Norris represented. A few, the older warriors who'd survived enough battles to recognize when survival required wisdom over pride, suggested a third option: leave it alone. Don't poke the cosmological anomaly. Don't test the thing that makes the Borg's adaptive consciousness commit suicide. Counselor Kampek, ancient and scarred from 100 campaigns, spoke with the weight of someone who'd learned that some victories cost more than defeats. We have lived because we knew when to fight. Knowing when not to fight is the same wisdom. The chamber fell silent. Not agreement. Just the recognition that disagreeing required answers none of them possessed. On Romulus, the Senate debated behind closed doors with the paranoia that had kept their empire alive for centuries. The Tal Shia had recovered data from the warbird that fled the Enterprise,
Sensor logs showing systems failing without being attacked, without being hacked, just choosing to stop functioning. Romulan logic prided itself on seeing 6 moves ahead, on manipulating variables others didn't know existed. But Chuck Norris wasn't a variable. Variables changed based on input. He was a constant masquerading as a person, and constants didn't negotiate or politic or scheme. Senator Vreenak, known for his strategic ruthlessness, made a proposal that shocked the chamber. Do nothing. Absolutely nothing. We infiltrate. We scheme. We manipulate, he said coldly. Those strategies require the other side to have weaknesses we can exploit. I see no evidence this entity has weaknesses. I see evidence that attempting to exploit them might teach us how quickly confidence becomes corpse. Deep in Dominion space, in the great link where the founders merged consciousness and debated existence itself, the revelation of Chuck Norris caused ripples in their fluid continuity. The founders had spent eons controlling the Gamma Quadrant through manipulation of solids. Those inferior beings trapped in permanent forms, predictable and exploitable. They'd engineered the Jem'Hadar as perfect soldiers, the Vorta as perfect administrators. Every species in their sphere existed as tools they'd shaped for specific purposes. But Chuck Norris suggested something that made their collective shudder. A solid that didn't behave like a solid, that existed with certainty, the founders associated only with themselves. One voice within the link, older and more cautious than most, suggested what others refused to consider. Perhaps the founders weren't the only certainty in the universe. Perhaps their destiny to rule wasn't as inevitable as they'd believed. The thought was heresy, and it spread. On Earth, in the Federation Council chambers overlooking San Francisco Bay, the debate had moved beyond Chuck Norris himself to what his existence implied about Federation philosophy. Ambassador Teppel from Vulcan spoke with Vulcan logic stripped to its foundations. We have built our civilization on the premise that logic and reason can address any challenge. This being operates on logic so fundamental it makes our reason look like approximation. Not wrong, just incomplete. Human counselors argued that the Federation's strength was its principles: diplomacy, cooperation, mutual understanding. But those principles assumed mutual comprehension was possible. Chuck Norris comprehended just fine. He simply existed in a framework where comprehension changed nothing about outcomes. The discussion spiraled into philosophy departments across Federation space. University professors suddenly found their ethics classes packed with officers asking questions like, what does agency mean if certainty exists? Picard sat in his quarters, reading reports from Starfleet Command that grew more urgent and less coherent by the hour. Admirals wanted assessments, predictions, containment strategies, deployment protocols. They wanted to know if Chuck Norris could be directed at Federation enemies, could be convinced to help against future threats, could be studied, replicated, understood. Each question made Picard's head ache worse. They were treating Chuck like a weapon that needed an instruction manual. But weapons were built with purpose. Tools served functions. Chuck Norris served nothing because serving implied subservience to goals, and goals implied uncertainty about outcomes. He read a classified report from Starfleet Intelligence. 3 different species had independently cancelled planned military operations against Federation interests in the past week. Not because of Chuck Norris directly, because they couldn't calculate odds anymore. The universe's strategic mathematics had a new constant, and no one knew how to factor it into their equations. Guinan found him in 10 forward at 0200 hours, staring at synthahole that wasn't helping. She sat without asking, her ancient eyes carrying the weight of centuries that had taught her when to speak and when to just be present. Finally, she broke the silence. I've lived a long time, Jean-Luc. Seen species rise and fall. Seen empires built on principles that seemed eternal until they weren't. You know what scares civilizations more than destruction? Picard looked at her, exhausted. What? Guinan's voice was soft. Irrelevance. Every power in the quadrant built their identity on being the biggest, the smartest, the most adaptable. Chuck Norris doesn't challenge those identities. He makes them beside the point. That's why they're all paralyzed. They can handle defeat. They can't handle not mattering. Picard closed his eyes. Outside viewport, stars burned with the same indifference they'd always shown. The universe didn't care about Federation principles or Klingon honor or Romulan schemes. Perhaps it never had. Perhaps they'd just been lucky enough not to notice. Starfleet Command Chakeli Hui that would determine not just policy, but philosophy. Admiral Elena Nechayev stood at the head of the table, her face carrying the particular exhaustion of someone forced to make decisions without adequate information or precedent. 20 senior officers filled the room. Admirals, captains, intelligence directors, Federation Council liaisons. On the view screen, projected larger than life, was a single still image of Chuck Norris standing in the Enterprise cargo bay, unmoving, unremarkable, terrifying in its ordinariness. Nechayev spoke with the bluntness that had made her simultaneously respected and feared. We need to decide what he is, asset or threat, tool or problem. Because every species with weapons is watching how we handle this, and our decision will echo for decades. The room understood. This wasn't about Chuck Norris. This was about who the Federation became in response to him. Admiral Ross from Strategic Operations presented the tactical perspective with PowerPoint precision that felt obscene given the subject matter. 3 scenarios. First, weaponization. Find ways to deploy Chuck Norris against Federation enemies. The Dominion still controlled the Gamma Quadrant. The Borg had thousands of cubes beyond the one that went dark. Hostile species throughout the galaxy, who'd think twice about aggression if they knew the Federation had access to living inevitability. Second scenario. Containment. Find some way to isolate him. Study him, ensure he couldn't destabilize the quadrant further. Third scenario, elimination. Ross said the word carefully, knowing it landed like a phaser blast. We don't know if it's possible, but if he's destabilizing galactic peace, we may need to consider all options. The silence that followed was the kind that precedes either violence or epiphany. No one was sure which. Captain Picard stood, his voice carrying the moral weight that had made him Starfleet's conscience. He's not a weapon. He's not a tool. He's a person. And the moment we start treating sentient beings as strategic assets, we've lost what makes the Federation worth defending. Nechayev cut him off with surgical precision. Jean-Luc, I respect your principles. But principles don't survive first contact with extinction. If the Borg adapt and return with 1,000 cubes, if the Dominion launches full-scale invasion, if any of the 100 species that want us dead decide this is their moment, do we let Federation citizens die because we're too principled to use available resources? The question hung like an executioner's blade. Picard wanted to argue, wanted to cite the Prime Directive, Federation Charter, the ethical frameworks that separated them from empires built on conquest. But the words felt hollow against the reality that principles were luxuries purchased with security. Commander Shelby from Tactical offered a compromise that felt like poison wrapped in logic. We don't weaponize him. We just ask, make him aware of threats, Present him with situations where Federation lives are at stake. If he chooses to help, that's his agency. If he doesn't, we've lost nothing but time. Several heads nodded. It felt reasonable, felt ethical, even respecting Chuck's autonomy, while hoping he'd volunteer his inevitable effectiveness. Picard saw through it immediately. You're describing manipulation, emotional leverage, putting him in positions where inaction means watching people die, betting that he'll intervene. That's not respect for agency. That's exploitation with extra steps. Shelby didn't flinch. Then what do you suggest, Captain? We pretend he doesn't exist while threats are nos. Hope that being morally pure will matter when Federation worlds burn. The question was unfair. It was also unanswerable. Dr. Crusher, attending via holo conference from the Enterprise, injected medical perspective that shifted the conversation's axis. Has anyone considered that we're asking the wrong questions? We're debating how to use him without asking what using him does to us. The Klingons question their warrior culture. The Romulans hesitate to scheme. The Borg's certainty broke against his. Every species that encounters Chuck Norris questions their foundational assumptions. What happens to the Federation if we make him our strategic centerpiece? Do we stop developing technology? Because why bother when we have him? Do we stop training tacticians? Do we atrophy because someone else ensures outcomes? The room went quiet. Crusher had named the deeper fear, not that Chuck Norris would destroy them, but that relying on him would destroy what made them themselves. Dependence on inevitability was just another form of assimilation. Admiral Haftel, representing Starfleet Research and Development, proposed something that made everyone uncomfortable in different ways. We study him, not as weapon, as phenomenon. Figure out what makes him function on that level. Is it quantum mechanics we don't understand? Dimensional physics? Some aspect of consciousness that operates outside standard causality? If we understood the mechanism, we could potentially replicate it, or at least defend against it if something similar emerges as hostile. Picard's objection was immediate. You're talking about vivisecting a sentient being's existence to reverse engineer certainty. That's not science. That's violation. Haftel's response was colder than space between stars. Captain, science has always been about understanding what we don't comprehend. Fire scared our ancestors until they understood combustion. This is the same process at a higher order. Picard stood, voice tight. Fire doesn't have rights. Chuck Norris does. Or have we decided personhood expires when it becomes inconvenient to our curiosity? The debate spiraled for 3 hours, covering ethical philosophy, tactical necessity, existential risk, and the fundamental question no one wanted to voice but everyone was thinking. What if Chuck Norris decided the Federation was a problem? Not hostile decision, just that calm certainty that outcomes would be better if the Federation concluded. He'd ended a Borg cube without hostility, without malice, just presence that made continued Borg existence logically untenable. What if he looked at the Federation's bureaucracy, its compromises, its thousand small hypocrisies that plague any large civilization, and decided with that same flat certainty that it was unnecessary? They couldn't stop him, couldn't fight him, couldn't even slow him down. The Federation existed at his pleasure, whether he conceptualized it as pleasure or not. Every principle they'd built, every value they'd defended, all of it rested on the foundation that he continued to be present without being active. Nekshev called for a vote, knowing it would solve nothing but create the illusion of decision. 3 options on the table: weaponization, Attempt to deploy Chuck Norris against Federation enemies through request and moral persuasion. Containment, isolate, and study, while
preventing further destabilization. Neutrality, maintain current status. Observe, adapt as situation develops. Hands went up. Calculations were made. The result was almost perfectly split, which meant consensus was impossible, and whoever made the final call would carry the weight alone. Nechayev stared at the voting display, then at Picard on the view screen, then at the still image of Chuck Norris standing unremarkable and absolute. She made the decision that would define her legacy. Neutrality. For now, we observe, we adapt. We don't weaponize, don't contain, don't antagonize, and we pray to whatever God still listen that this doesn't come back to end us. It wasn't courage. It wasn't wisdom. It was just the least terrible option in a situation where every choice felt like negotiating with entropy. 3 weeks passed in a silence louder than war. The Cardassian border, typically alive with patrol skirmishes and territorial probing, went quiet. Romulan spy networks withdrew from Federation space like receding tide, leaving listening posts abandoned and deep cover agents recalled without explanation. Even the Maquis, those desperate Federation colonists turned terrorists, ceased their raids on Cardassian supply lines. It wasn't peace. Peace implies agreement, negotiation, mutual understanding reached through dialogue. This was cessation. The galaxy's predators had simultaneously decided that testing boundaries wasn't worth the risk of discovering what Chuck Norris considered a problem worth addressing. Starfleet intelligence analysts stared at their suddenly empty threat boards with the unsettled confusion of guards realizing the prison was keeping them in, not the inmates out. The absence of conflict felt more ominous than its presence ever had. On Deep Space Nine, Commander Sisko stood in ops watching sensor displays that showed nothing happening with aggressive consistency. No Dominion probes through the wormhole. No Cardassian provocations. No pirate raids on shipping lanes. Major Kira stood beside him. Bajoran skepticism etched into every line of her face. She'd fought Cardassians for decades, knew their patterns like she knew her own heartbeat. "They're waiting," she said quietly, "watching to see what we do with him." Sisko nodded, jaw tight. He'd built his career on being 3 moves ahead, on reading opponents and anticipating their strategies. But this wasn't strategy. This was every major power simultaneously folding their cards without seeing the flop. Not because the Federation had won, because the game itself had become unpredictable in ways that made playing it potentially fatal. Victories and defeats both required participants to believe outcomes were contestable. In the Klingon Empire, the silence manifested differently. Warriors still trained, ships still patrolled, but the songs in the great halls had changed. New verses emerged, passed warrior to warrior, with the underground persistence of ideas that can't be suppressed only because no one wanted to be first to voice them publicly. The songs asked questions. Klingon culture had spent centuries not asking. What is honor when outcomes are predetermined? What is glory when victory isn't earned through struggle? What does it mean to be a warrior in a universe containing something that makes warfare itself look like a elaborate theater? The Empire's philosophers, those old warriors who'd survived enough battles to think about them, gathered in private. They debated whether Chuck Norris was curse or blessing. Curse because he undermined everything they'd built identity upon. Blessing because he forced them to ask if their identity was worth the foundation it stood on. The Dominion's response was most unsettling, precisely because it was no response at all. The founders, who'd spent the past year
escalating their presence in the Alpha Quadrant, simply stopped. The Jem'Hadar fleets that had been massing at strategic positions dispersed to routine patrol patterns. Vorta diplomats ceased their careful manipulation of lesser species. Intelligence reports suggested internal debate among the founders themselves, unprecedented for beings who communed in liquid unity, where dissent was supposed to be impossible. Starfleet xenopsychologists theorized the founders were experiencing existential crisis. They built their entire civilization on the certainty that they were meant to bring order to chaos, that their superiority was cosmological fact. Chuck Norris represented a different kind of order, one that didn't need the founders' permission or participation. Being irrelevant to the universe's organizing principles was worse than being opposed by them. On the Enterprise, routine became surreal. Chuck Norris continued occupying the cargo bay with the same unmoving presence he'd maintained since arrival. Crew members grew accustomed to him, the way you grow accustomed to a star visible from your bedroom window, always there, constant, unaffected by your awareness of it. Some crew tried engaging him in conversation, asking questions that ranged from philosophical to mundane. Where was he from? What did he want? Did he need anything? His answers, when he gave them, were brief to the point of being cryptic. Not intentionally mysterious, just precise beyond the questioner's framework. Ensign Martinez asked if Chuck was happy. Chuck looked at him with those unchanged eyes and said, "Happiness is a variable." Martinez spent 3 days asking philosophers what that meant. None had satisfying answers. Lieutenant Barclay, whose social anxiety made him surprisingly perceptive about outsider perspectives, started leaving PADs in the cargo bay loaded with information about the Federation. History files, cultural databases, entertainment media. Not as a gift, Chuck never touched them, just as context. If this being was going to exist among them, maybe understanding them would matter, or maybe it wouldn't. Barclay wasn't sure which outcome he preferred. Understanding implied judgment. Judgment implied Chuck might evaluate the Federation and find it wanting. The PAD sat untouched for days before Barclay quietly retrieved them, uncertain whether he felt relief or disappointment. Geordi asked him why he'd bothered. Barclay's answer was honest, because doing nothing felt like giving up, and giving up felt like dying slowly. Geordi had no response to that, neither did anyone else. Guinan spent more time in the cargo bay than most, sitting in meditation-like silence near Chuck without attempting conversation. When Picard asked why, she gave one of her enigmatic smiles. "He reminds me of something I encountered centuries ago. A spatial phenomenon that ships had to navigate around because it couldn't be moved, and trying to move, it would tear subspace apart. Eventually people stopped thinking of it as obstacle and started thinking of it as landmark. Chuck's the same, not obstacle, not ally, just reference point. The galaxy has to build its navigation around." Picard considered that, and if the galaxy doesn't want to navigate around him. Guinan's smile faded. Then the galaxy learns why reference points are fixed, which Chuck's the same, usually by colliding with them. The conversation stayed with Picard for days, worming into his thoughts during quiet moments. The Federation had always believed in progress, in pushing boundaries, in refusing to accept the universe's limitations. Chuck Norris was a limitation that didn't care about their refusal. The silence held for 23 days. 23 days of galactic powers watching each other, watching the Federation, watching the thing that looked like a man sitting in a cargo bay radiating calm certainty. 23 days of tactical officers running simulations that crashed. Intelligence agencies analyzing data that revealed nothing. politicians debating strategies that felt hollow. And then, on day 24, sensors detected something that made every analyst's blood run cold. A Borg cube heading toward Federation space. Not the same cube Chuck had neutralized. That one still drifted, its drones barely alive and deeply traumatized. A new cube, faster, more aggressive, transmitting one message on all frequencies that suggested the collective had processed what happened and reached a conclusion. Adaptation complete. Resistance is futile. The silence shattered, and everyone looked to see what Chuck Norris would do about something that claimed to have adapted to him. The Borg cube emerged from transwarp conduit, like a geometric tumor metastasizing into real space, larger than the previous one. Not just physically, tactically. This cube moved with purposeful variation, its flight pattern randomized in ways Borg cubes never randomized anything. The collective had studied its failure, analyzed the collapse of its cognitive processes, and concluded the problem was predictability. If Chuck Norris represented certainty, the Borg would counter with calculated chaos, uncertainty as weapon. Their hail came through on all frequencies, that flat multi-voice carrying something new underneath. Not quite desperation, but the mathematical equivalent. They'd evolved specifically to handle one variable. The variable currently sitting cross-legged in a cargo bay, expression unchanged, while Starfleet scrambled battle stations around him. Picard felt old trauma mixing with new dread. The Borg adapted. That was their nature. Had they adapted to inevitability itself? Worf ran tactical analysis that looked worse with every passing second. This cube wasn't approaching the Enterprise. It was approaching the Alraki system. Federation colony. Population 8 million. Minimal defensive capability. Standard Borg target selection except for timing. They were forcing a choice. Let them assimilate 8 million people, or bring Chuck Norris into direct engagement again. Picard saw the trap immediately. If Chuck stopped them, the Borg would gather more data. If he didn't, the Federation would have to watch millions die, while their ultimate deterrent sat inactive. Psychological warfare targeting both Chuck's potential moral framework and Starfleet's principles simultaneously. It was elegant in the way that surgical strikes are elegant. Precise application of force at the point of maximum vulnerability. The collective had learned more from its defeat than anyone realized. It had learned to target contexts instead of opponents. Picard entered the cargo bay, finding Chuck in his customary position. But something was different, minor. Chuck's head was tilted perhaps 3 degrees more than usual. Eyes focused on something external observers couldn't see. They're targeting a colony, Picard said, voice tight. 8 million people. I can't order you to help. Can't even ask without it being manipulation. But they're counting on you doing nothing, while they prove you're not the solution to every problem. Chuck looked at him with those unreadable eyes. They're correct, he said simply. Picard felt something crack in his chest. Then millions die. Chuck stood in one fluid motion that suggested he'd been planning to stand, and Picard's arrival simply coincided with that decision. Millions die regardless. Different timelines, different causes. Death is certainty. Timing is variable. The philosophy was accurate and horrifying. Picard wanted to argue ethics, to appeal to humanity, but Chuck was already walking toward the exit, not rushed, just moving with destination. The Enterprise warped toward Alrakis at maximum speed, arriving to find the Borg cube already in orbit. Assimilation beams active. Population screaming on all frequencies for help that wouldn't arrive in time. Picard gave orders knowing they were gestures, target weapons, prepare boarding parties, evacuate who they could. Everything that would accomplish nothing against Borg efficiency. Chuck Norris stood on the bridge, watching the view screen with that same neutral expression. The cube had already begun adapting. Its shields modulated in non-patterns. Its drones moved with deliberate randomness. The collective had analyzed the previous encounter and concluded Chuck's effect worked through predictable systems, so they'd made themselves unpredictable. Worf reported what sensors were showing. The cube's processing patterns looked like chaos, mathematics, structured randomness, designed to have no structure to collapse. The Borg had become quantum uncertain. Schrodinger's assimilators. Chuck walked toward the view screen, and the bridge crew instinctively moved aside. He placed his palm against the display, that same gesture that had disabled the Romulan. On the cube, nothing happened. Drones continued working, systems continued functioning. The collective had adapted, had found a way to operate that Chuck's certainty couldn't touch, because they'd removed certainty from their operations. Random number generation at the quantum level. Every decision made by probability instead of logic. They'd sacrificed efficiency for immunity, trading optimal operation for survival. It was insane by Borg standards, and it was working. Picard watched Chuck's expression for any change. Frustration, surprise, concern. Nothing. The same calm acknowledgement that what was happening was happening. They've adapted, Picard said, voice hollow. Chuck nodded once. Yes, just that. Just acknowledgement of observable fact. The collective transmitted a message directly to Chuck, bypassing the Enterprise's communication system to speak through every speaker on the ship simultaneously. We are Borg. We have adapted. Certainty cannot affect uncertainty. Your presence is now irrelevant. The words were chosen with precision that suggested the collective understood psychology better than anyone credited. They weren't gloating. They were stating what they believed was mathematical truth. Chuck had ended them through predictable patterns. They'd removed patterns. Problem solved. Adaptation complete. Below on Alrakis, 18,000 people had already been assimilated, their screens cutting off mid-transmission as nanoprobes rewrote their biology. Picard's hands gripped his chair arms until his knuckles whitened. He'd brought Chuck here believing inevitability would save them. Instead, he'd proven that inevitability had limits, and 8 million people would pay for that lesson. Chuck Norris spoke, voice cutting through the bridge's despair with the same flat certainty it always carried. Randomness is predictable. The statement made no logical sense.
Randomness, by definition, was unpredictable, was the entire point. E-Date's head tilted. Processing. Captain, true randomness is actually deterministic at the quantum level. E-Date. It only appears random because observers lack complete information. If one possessed perfect information about initial conditions, he stopped mid-sentence. Artificial intelligence catching up to implication. Perfect information. Complete awareness of all variables. Chuck wasn't observing the cube's randomness. He was observing the substrate randomness emerged from the quantum states themselves, the probability fields. Not the outputs, but the inputs. The Borg had made themselves unpredictable to observers operating at their level. But Chuck operated at a level where predictability wasn't observation. It was axiom. On the cube, every drone simultaneously stopped mid-action. Not frozen, not crashed, just ceased functioning as if someone had cut power to reality itself. The randomness they built their adaptation around collapsed, not because it was defeated, but because it was revealed as illusion. There is no true randomness,
when you exist at the level of causality itself. The Borg had tried to hide in quantum uncertainty, but uncertainty only exists for observers who don't have complete information. Chuck Norris didn't observe outcomes. He was the context outcomes occurred within. The cube went dark again, faster this time. 16,000 drones standing in corridors, their individual consciousnesses flooding back. The collective's desperate adaptation revealed as profound misunderstanding of what it faced. You can't randomize against certainty. You can only reveal that what you thought was randomness was always just complex pattern you couldn't see from inside the system. The second Borg cube's failure echoed across subspace faster than the first. This time, there was no ambiguity, no room for alternate interpretations. The collective had specifically adapted to counter Chuck Norris, had sacrificed efficiency and logic for quantum unpredictability, had rebuilt their operational framework from foundational mathematics upward, and Chuck had ended them with the same effortless certainty he'd shown the first cube. The recording of his statement, "Randomness is predictable," circulated through intelligence networks like a virus, analyzed by every strategic think tank in known space. Vulcan Science Academy mathematicians spent 72 sleepless hours trying to understand what level of existence Chuck operated on. Where randomness became deterministic, they concluded either he was lying, impossible, or existed at a level of causality their physics couldn't model. None of those conclusions were comforting. On Romulus, the Senate convened an emergency session behind security, so tight it bordered on paranoia. Senator Vreenik stood before the chamber, his face carrying the hollowed expression of someone forced to speak truths that unmade certainty. "The Borg are our nightmare," he said quietly. "We've planned for them, built strategies, developed weapons, maintained intelligence networks solely to track their movements. They are the existential threat we measure all other threats against." He paused, letting that settle. "And twice now, they've been rendered irrelevant by one human who isn't even trying. Not weapons, not technology, just presence." The word hung like execution notice. The Empire had survived millennia through manipulation, through seeing angles others missed, through being smarter and more ruthless than their enemies. Chuck Norris made intelligence irrelevant, made ruthlessness beside the point, made their entire strategic framework look like children playing politics in a universe that had moved beyond politics. The Klingon Empire's response was more visceral. Warriors throughout the quadrant began questioning not just tactics but purpose. What did honor mean against inevitability? What was glory worth when outcomes were predetermined? The philosophical crisis that had started in back rooms and quiet halls now erupted into public discourse. On the homeworld, young warriors challenged elders, demanding answers about what it meant to be Klingon in a universe where Chuck Norris existed. Some elders tried maintaining traditional responses, that honor was about how you faced destiny, not whether you could change it. Others broke under the weight of questions they'd spent lifetimes avoiding. Chancellor Gowron watched his empire fragment, not through external conquest but internal doubt. The Empire's strength had always been certainty in their warrior identity. Chuck Norris was teaching them that certainty came in hierarchies, and theirs was lower on the ladder than they'd believed. The Dominion's founders faced their own reckoning in the Great Link. For the first time in recorded history, the Link showed signs of actual division. Not disagreement, They'd always had that. Division, fragments of consciousness that couldn't merge fully because they'd reached fundamentally different conclusions about reality. Some founders argued Chuck Norris proved the solids were more dangerous than they'd calculated, that eliminating Alpha Quadrant species was now survival necessity. Others argued the opposite, that attempting to eliminate something containing Chuck Norris would teach them how thoroughly outmatched they were. A third faction suggested something that horrified the rest. Perhaps the founders weren't actually meant to rule. Perhaps their certainty about destiny was just another form of the solids delusion. The link began showing physical manifestations of philosophical crisis areas where the fluid wouldn't properly merge. Consciousness trapped in semi-solid states. They were crystallizing around unanswerable questions. On Earth, Federation Council chambers became philosophy symposiums. Representatives from hundreds of member worlds debated what Chuck Norris meant for Federation principles. Ambassador T'Pel from Vulcan presented the logical analysis with characteristic precision. We have operated on the assumption that sufficiently advanced reason can solve any problem. That dialogue and cooperation can overcome any obstacle. Chuck Norris exists as proof that some obstacles aren't obstacles at all. They're simply facts of reality that no amount of dialogue changes. This doesn't invalidate our principles, but it places them in context we've been privileged to avoid until now. The human delegation struggled with that. Privilege felt like accusation. T'Pel's response was gentle by Vulcan standards. Acknowledging context isn't weakness, it's maturity. Children believe their parents are omnipotent. Adults learn omnipotence was never the foundation of safety. The Federation must make the same transition. Starfleet Academy implemented emergency curriculum changes. Tactical courses that had taught adaptability and creative problem-solving now included sections on recognizing when those skills were categorically insufficient. Philosophy departments exploded with enrollment as officers sought frameworks for understanding certainty beyond their control. Dr. Zimmerman, creator of the EMH, gave a lecture that was recorded and disseminated fleet-wide. We've spent centuries building technology that expands capability, warp, drive, transporters, replicators. Each one overcame limitation we thought was fundamental. Chuck Norris teaches us that capability has upper bounds, not technological bounds, ontological bounds. There exists a level of reality where our tools don't apply, where more computing power, better sensors, faster ships, none of it matters because we're trying to affect variables we don't have access to. Students asked how to prepare for that. Zimmerman's answer was honest. You don't. You accept it and build your strategies around acknowledgement instead of resistance. On the Enterprise, crew morale became strange ecosystem of acceptance and unease. Chuck Norris continued occupying the cargo bay, unchanged by his second demonstration. Crew members passed him during shifts, offering polite nods he sometimes returned with microscopic acknowledgement. It felt absurd. This being who'd ended the Borg twice, who'd made the Quadrant superpowers question their foundations, just sitting cross-legged in their cargo bay, like a statue that occasionally confirmed it was alive. Ensign Gomez from engineering asked Guinan how to think about him. Guinan's answer was characteristically enigmatic. You ever stand at the edge of the Grand Canyon? Gomez nodded. Did you feel threatened by it? Gomez shook her head. Did you feel it was your friend? Another head shake. There you go. Chuck's like that. Not for us or against us. Just immensely present. and we have to decide how we navigate around that presence. Gomez thought about that. What if we don't want to navigate around it? Guinan smiled sadly. Then we learn why canyons don't move for our preferences. Picard compiled reports from across the quadrant, watching in real time as the galaxy's power structure underwent philosophical earthquake. Empires that had spent centuries building military might suddenly questioning whether might mattered. Civilizations that had survived through cunning suddenly unsure if cunning was relevant. Every strategic framework, every tactical doctrine, every carefully constructed advantage, all of it rendered conditional by one human sitting in a cargo bay, radiating certainty that operated on principles they couldn't access. He thought about Starfleet's mission, to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new life and new civilizations. They'd found new life. It just turned out that some new life existed at levels that made exploration look like children collecting rocks on a beach, while tsunamis rewrote the coastline behind them. The Enterprise was humanity's flagship, and its cargo bay contained something that made flags themselves seem like optimistic decoration. Symbols of power deployed by species still learning what power actually meant. 6 months after Chuck Norris appeared, the galaxy had achieved something historians would later struggle to categorize. Not peace. Peace implies resolution. Agreement reached through compromise or exhaustion. Not armistice. That implies parties still capable of war, who've chosen temporary cessation. This was something else entirely. Paralysis masquerading as stability. The Dominion hadn't withdrawn from Alpha Quadrant ambitions because the Federation convinced them. The Borg hadn't stopped assimilating because they'd found a better purpose. The Klingons hadn't abandoned conquest because honor demanded it. Every aggressive species, every expansionist empire, every civilization built on the premise that force could reshape reality, all of them had simply stopped. Stopped because continuing meant potentially encountering something that made their force irrelevant. The galaxy was quiet, and in that quiet, something fundamental had broken that no one wanted to name. On the Enterprise, systems started showing a peculiar inefficiency. Nothing critical, just small degradations. Response times slightly slower. Diagnostic routines finding fewer optimizations to implement. Geordi noticed it first, brought it to department heads who all reported similar phenomena. The ship's crew was getting comfortable. When you know the ultimate deterrent sits in your cargo bay, when you've watched it end the Borg twice without effort, why stay sharp? Why drill combat scenarios? Why push the boundaries of what your technology can do? The Enterprise had always been Starfleet's finest, because its crew refused to accept limitations. Now limitations felt quaint, unnecessary preparation for scenarios where preparation didn't matter. Captain Picard recognized the rot spreading through his ship's culture and found himself helpless to stop it. How do you inspire excellence when excellence has been made optional by proximity to something that makes outcomes predetermined? Across Federation space, the same pattern emerged. Academy enrollment dropped. Why become a tactical officer when tactics were obsolete? Why study xenopsychology when one human could neutralize species through sheer presence? Starfleet's Research and Development Division saw budget cuts as administrators quietly concluded that improving technology was less cost-effective than simply ensuring Chuck Norris remained friendly, or at least neutral. No one said it explicitly. No memos outlined the strategy, but resource allocation revealed truth that policy documents concealed. The Federation was slowly, incrementally, beginning to hollow out its own capability, because capability felt redundant next to certainty.
They were becoming dependent on something they didn't understand and couldn't control. The empire that had survived through innovation and cooperation was learning to survive through proximity to inevitability. And survival through proximity isn't survival. It's waiting to see if the thing you're proximate to decides you're unnecessary. The Klingon Empire, fragmented in ways that would have been unthinkable years prior. Entire houses abandoned martial tradition, arguing that warrior culture was obsolete in a universe where Chuck Norris existed. Others doubled down on tradition with desperate fervor, insisting that honor mattered regardless of efficacy. Civil war threatened. Chancellor Gowron tried holding the empire together through force of will and political maneuvering. But you can't maneuver around existential crisis. The empire's identity was warrior supremacy. That identity had been revealed as comforting fiction. Some Klingons adapted by finding new meaning in honor divorced from victory. Others shattered completely, unable to reconcile what they'd been taught with what reality demonstrated. The most tragic were young warriors who'd never fought a real battle because battles had stopped happening. They inherited warrior culture without context, like receiving an instruction manual for equipment that no longer existed. Their elders couldn't tell them what honor felt like, because honor required risk, and risk had been made optional. On Romulus, the Senate's paralysis evolved into something darker. If they couldn't outthink Chuck Norris, couldn't manipulate around him, couldn't scheme their way to advantage, what was the Empire's purpose? Romulans had survived through being smarter, more cunning, more willing to play long games while others focused on immediate gains. Chuck represented a game they couldn't play because he existed outside game theory. Some senators advocated withdrawal into isolation, building walls between Romulus and the galaxy until the Chuck Norris variable somehow resolved itself. Others suggested something that would have been heresy months prior. Maybe the Empire should just give up, not surrender. Just acknowledge that their strategic framework couldn't function and build a new one from scratch. The debate raged for weeks. No consensus emerged. The empire that had threatened the galaxy for centuries was eating itself trying to answer one question. What do you do when your core competency is irrelevant? The Dominion's founders made a decision that shocked the Alpha Quadrant. They withdrew, not just from expansion plans, from everything. Every Jem'Hadar ship recalled. Every Vorta administrator returned to Dominion space. The wormhole to the Gamma Quadrant saw Dominion vessels streaming through it in exodus that looked like retreat, but felt like something else. Starfleet intelligence tried to determine what triggered the withdrawal. The answer, when it emerged through carefully placed sources, was chilling in its simplicity. The founders had concluded their destiny to bring order to chaos was conditional. Conditional on no greater order existing. Chuck Norris represented order they couldn't improve upon, couldn't even understand. Continuing their mission meant eventual conflict with something that made conflict pointless. So they withdrew, not because they were defeated, but because their mission had become philosophically untenable. The empire that had terrified the Alpha Quadrant for years simply decided its raison d'etre no longer applied and went home. Civilizations don't usually get that kind of existential awareness, and when they do, it looks less like wisdom and more like civilizational depression. Picard stood in his ready room, reading reports that felt like eulogy for the galaxy he'd known. Everywhere he looked, the pattern repeated. Species that had driven progress through competition now stagnating because competition felt pointless. Empires that had expanded through conquest now contracting because conquest couldn't affect variables that mattered. The Federation was the most stable, but even they were showing signs of cultural atrophy.
Fewer kids dreaming of Starfleet, fewer researchers pushing boundaries, fewer explorers willing to risk the unknown, when the known included something that made risk calculation obsolete. He thought about humanity's history. Every major advancement came from necessity, agriculture from hunger, medicine from disease, space travel from curiosity and competition. Remove necessity, and species stop advancing. They plateau, they maintain. They exist without pushing forward, because forward has lost definition. Chuck Norris had saved the galaxy from the Borg, from the Dominion, from itself, and in saving it had taught it the wrong lesson. The wrong lesson was this, that certainty elsewhere excuses uncertainty in yourself, that someone else's competence excuses your incompetence, that proximity to power is the same as possessing power. The galaxy had learned to be comfortable. Comfortable was death stretched across decades. Species that stop struggling, stop evolving. Civilizations that stop facing challenges, stop developing tools to face them. The Borg had been nightmare, but nightmares kept the galaxy sharp, kept them innovating, cooperating, pushing boundaries, because survival demanded it. Chuck had removed the nightmare, and in its absence, the galaxy was slowly forgetting how to dream, how to strive, how to risk and fail, and learn and grow. They were becoming pets, comfortable, safe, domesticated things that existed at the pleasure of something that made their wildness unnecessary. No malice in it, no cruelty, just the inevitable consequence of existing near certainty so absolute, it made struggle seem like performance art. Chuck Norris sat in the cargo bay, unchanged and unchanging. He'd never asked to be anyone's savior, never volunteered to be the galaxy's deterrent. He just existed, and existence at his level meant everything else organized around him, whether he intended it or not. Stars don't choose to have gravity. Black holes don't decide to warp space. They simply are what they are, and the universe accommodates. Guinan visited him in the cargo bay one final time before the Enterprise's next mission. She sat in silence for an hour before speaking. You know what you've done to us. Not accusation, just question. Chuck looked at her with those unchanging eyes. Yes, he said simply. Guinan waited for elaboration. None came, because elaboration was unnecessary. He knew, had probably known from the moment he arrived, knew that his presence would teach the galaxy this lesson, and he existed anyway, because knowing consequences doesn't change certainty. You are what you are. The galaxy learns or doesn't, outcomes occur regardless. The Enterprise departed space dock for a routine patrol, the kind of mission that used to mean adventure and now meant maintenance. Picard sat in his chair, gave the order to engage, and felt nothing. No anticipation, no curiosity about what they'd find, because whatever they found, whatever challenged them, they had certainty in their cargo bay. If things went wrong, the galaxy was finally at peace, and no one was celebrating, because everyone understood, on some level too deep for words, that this peace wasn't victory. It was lesson in what happens when you're saved from yourself. You don't become better, you become dependent. And dependence doesn't build civilizations, it just maintains them until maintenance stops being enough, and by then you've forgotten how to do anything else. The stars burned with indifference. They always had. Humanity had just been lucky enough to misinterpret that indifference as invitation. Now they knew better, and knowing better felt like dying slowly across generations.